Welcome back to Chapter 4 in Unit 2. We're going to tackle question number 2. Again, these questions are exactly like you see in the book, so please follow along in there and take your notes and move along. Let's take a look at the first question. First of all, let's see what we're doing. We're going to be doing the opposite of what we did in the other question. Here we are going to go from the decimal equivalent and put it into the recipe amount. So we're going to go from a decimal number in, let's say, 14.2 pounds and put it into pounds and ounces and so on. So question number 1, we want to take 1.815 pounds and convert it into pounds and ounces. Now, luckily, this no-brainer part works in either direction. As you can see, we have 1 whole pound here in the decimal side. If we have 1 whole pound in the decimal, we are going to have 1 whole pound in the pound and ounces equivalent. So the 1 still is a 1 pound, even though we are trying to convert things to ounces. Now all we have to do is handle the decimal 815 pounds and figure out how we're going to put that into ounces. And of course, the biggest part of doing this is understanding the relationship between ounces and pound. And of course, there are 16 ounces to a pound. So instead of doing like we did in the last question, in this question here, we are going to multiply. But what's very, very important is we understand that we multiply the decimal 815, not just 815. You have to have the decimal in there. And what do we multiply it by? The relationship between ounces and pounds. So decimal 815 times 16 equals 13.04 ounces. Now we look at the rounding aspect of the question, and we notice that here in brackets, they want us to round it off to the nearest ounce. So we have 1 pound and 13.04 ounces. So the 13.04 ounces is either going to be 13 or 14 ounces, and using whatever trick you want to, but I think just a little bit of observation will let us know that it certainly does round to 1 pound 13 ounces even. Question number 2. 2.875 US quarts. We want to convert that to US quarts and ounces. Again, the no-brainer part, 2 whole US quarts is always going to be 2 whole US quarts. We then have to deal with decimal 875. We now know we need to multiply that, but we need to multiply it by the relationship between ounces and US quarts, and that happens to be 32. 32 ounces in a US quart. So we take the decimal equivalent of US quarts, in this case decimal 875, and multiply it by 32, and that gives us 28. So our final answer is 2 US quarts and 28 ounces is equal to 2.875 US quarts. So let's move on to question C. We have 1.26 pounds. We want to convert that to pounds and ounces, rounding it off to the nearest half ounce. Again, the easy part, 1 whole pound is always 1 whole pound. Now we take the decimal 26 and multiply it by the relationship between ounces and pounds. That hasn't changed. Decimal 26 times the 16 ounces there are in 1 pound. That leaves us with 4.16 ounces. We need to round that off to the nearest half ounce. And again, using whatever trick you want, it's either going to be 4 ounces or 4.5 ounces. So 4 or 4.5. Well, 4.1 is closer to 4 than 4.5, so your final answer should be 1 pound 4 ounces. Next question, 2.625 US gallons. We want to convert that to US gallons and ounces. Again, we know half of this question without even trying. We still have 2 whole US gallons. We deal with a decimal 625. The relationship between ounces and US gallons is 128. So we take decimal 625 and multiply it by 128, the amount of ounces in a US gallon, and we end up with 80 ounces. So our final answer ends up being 2 US gallons and 80 ounces. Moving along, we have decimal 0.48 liters, and we want to convert that into milliliters and round that off to the nearest 5 milliliters. Well, luckily, the metric system is quite simple. Here in this example, we have no whole liters. It's 0.048. So we're not going to have a no-brainer part to this, but we simply deal with the decimal 0.48. And what we do is we multiply that by the amount of milliliters in a liter. Love the metric system. It's 1,000. Decimal 0.048 times 1,000 equals 48 milliliters. That's our unrounded answer. They want us to round it to the nearest 5 milliliters, so it's either going to be 45 milliliters or 50 milliliters. Again, you need to figure out which one it's closest to. The old trick that I've been teaching you is that you add your two options. 45 is the low, 50 is the high. Add that together and divide it by 2, and you'll end up with 47.5. Here we have 48 milliliters, so it stands to reason that it's going to round to 50 milliliters. Remember, rounding is still very important in this course. It does indeed add up to about 30% of what you're going to get as a final mark. You must understand how to round properly. Next question, we're going to take decimal 135 liters, and we're going to convert that to milliliters and round it off to the nearest 5 milliliters, just like we did above. Again, there is no whole liter here, so we don't have to worry about that. We simply multiply decimals 135 by 1,000, the amount of milliliters in a liter, and we get 135 milliliters. Oh my goodness, aren't we lucky? It's rounded to the nearest 5 milliliters. We're done. We can move on. If only everything in life was this simple. Our next question is 3.662 liters, and we want to convert that into liters and milliliters, rounding it off to the nearest 5 mils. Well, here we do indeed have whole liters. We have 3 whole liters, and just because it's metric, nothing changes. 3 whole liters will always be 3 whole liters. We then take the decimal 662 and multiply it by its relationship to liters. So we take decimal 662 times 1,000, again, 1,000 milliliters in a liter, and we end up with 662 milliliters as an unrounded answer. We now have to round that to the nearest 5. So it's either going to be 660 or 665. And whatever trick you use, you need to understand that once you do round it to the nearest 5 milliliters, you're going to end up with 500 or 660 milliliters. So 3 liters, 660 milliliters is the final answer to this. So if you want to recap this quickly, we take the decimal equivalent and we multiply it, decimal and all, with the relationship between the two measures that we're trying to convert to. If we're going from pounds and ounces, we multiply the decimal pound equivalent by 16 ounces, because 16 ounces in a pound. The metric, it just gets easy. With a metric, we're always multiplying by 1,000. So there you go. Let's move on and go to the next question.